Good afternoon and good evening to those of you joining us from Europe. I'm Ken Rosenberg, a member of the Socialist Caucus of the American Public Health Association. This is the sixth session in our series, Socialist Perspectives on Public Health. Our speaker today is Niels Brimnes, who will talk about the socialist legacy of Halfdan Mahler. Ted Brown will introduce him in a moment. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer session curated by Ted Brown for the rest of the hour. Please submit your questions through the Zoom chat function. The session will be recorded and posted on YouTube. If you want to learn more about SCAPHA, you can contact us at socialistcaucusapha@gmail.com. Ted?
Thank you, Ken. It's a great pleasure to introduce Niels Brimnes, who was a Danish scholar who did his undergraduate and initial graduate work in history at Aarhus University in Denmark, and who received his PhD in history from Cambridge University in England in 1996. From 1997 to 1999, Niels was an archivist at the Danish National Archives in Copenhagen. He joined the history faculty at Aarhus in 1999, where he is currently associate professor. Niels has also been a visiting scholar at University College in London, at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and a number of other universities, notably in India. He has published on Indian colonialism, smallpox, vaccination, and popular resistance in colonial India, resistance to tuberculosis vaccination in post-colonial India, and has published a book on tuberculosis, the state, and international assistance in 20th century India, which appeared in 2016. Niels has recently been working on the multiple roads leading to and away from the Alma Ata Declaration of 1978, which we will be hearing more about, and has studied in detail the role that Halfdan Mahler, Danish physician and WHO Director General from 1973 to 1988, played before, during, and after the Alma Ata Conference of September 1978. It has been my personal good fortune and great pleasure to work over the past couple of years with Niels and another colleague, Marcus Cueto of Rio de Janeiro, on a project that we hope will materialize in a detailed personal, institutional, political, and intellectual biography of Halfdan Mahler. Niels?
Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about Halfdan Mahler and his views on health and healthcare. I think we should have the slides up now, please. Yeah, thank you. As Ted just mentioned, I have an ambition to write a book about Halfdan Mahler together with Marcus Cueto and Ted. And the title you see on the slide is my original title. I was told that it was too long to be used for online advertising, but I retain it here because I think it provides the best impression of what I have to say. And I should perhaps also warn you that I'm going to speak more about what I would call the roots or origins of elements in Halfdan Mahler's thinking, which could be understood as socialist. Then I will be speaking about its legacy. But I would like to start with an informal piece of information, which I got from my colleague and hopeful future co-author, Marcus Cueto. Marcus is among the fortunate few that managed to get an interview with Mahler in his old age. Asked which country he thought had made most progress towards realizing the goals of primary healthcare, the doctrine of health so intimately associated with Mahler's tenure as Director General of the WHO, Mahler answered without hesitation, Scandinavia. Now, does this make Mahler a socialist? By pointing to the Scandinavian welfare state as an ideal, Mahler referred to a mixed economy with a large public sector, including a free, or rather a tax-funded, because nothing is free, universal health service, which have made private health operators marginal, almost redundant. To an American audience, this might indeed cast Mahler as a socialist. And I'm convinced that Mahler would agree, for instance, with Bernie Sanders on a great many issues. But to me, as a Scandinavian and as a European, it makes Mahler a social democrat, because we do not consider the Scandinavian model of society and the Scandinavian model of healthcare that Mahler referred to be socialist. We consider it to be social democratic, regulated market economies with large public sectors. Now, I shall not delve further into a discussion of the many possible meanings of the word socialism, but rather ask, why should we understand Mahler as a socialist in the first place? Where does this assumption come from? And next slide, please. Is it because of the reference to social justice in Article 5 of the 1978 Alma Ata Declaration on Primary Healthcare, which of course is also closely associated to Mahler? Is it because of Mahler's aggressive rhetoric in his opening speech at Alma Ata, where he urged people to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and also referred to international solidarity in health? Is it because of his explicit support for the call for a new international economic order, both before and after the Alma Ata conference? Is it because of the increasingly desperate language employed by Mahler in the neoliberal 1980s, exemplified here on the slide by his 1986 address to the World Health Assembly, where he talked about being stuck, and I quote, up to our necks in verbal mud and fighting all sorts of conceptual alligators, end of quote? Or is it because Mahler had the stamina to confront the pharmaceutical industry in the wake of Alma Ata and insist that a list of essential drugs were drawn up? Now, Mahler, he was obviously thriving in the leftist anti-market 1970s, but found his professional life increasingly difficult in the neoliberal 1980s. It positions him clearly left of center in the political spectrum, but it does not necessarily make him a socialist. And scholars tend to agree. Let me provide a brief summary of how historians and political scientists have described him in recent works. And next slide, please. Now, Cueto, Brown, and Fee, in their recent account of the history of the World Health Organization, refers to his emphatic advocacy of social justice. Randall Packard emphasizes his commitment to community participation and also mentions his mistrust in top-down planning. Next slide, please. Nitzan Chorev is fascinated by the pragmatism that accompanied his well-known idealism and his often mentioned missionary zeal. And Kelly Lee underlines his strong moral commitment to social justice, not unlike Cueto, Brown, and Fee, and that's not surprising because Lee writes on the basis of an earlier article by Marcos Cueto. Next slide, please. And political scientist Tina Hanrieder sees him as a person with radical views, but also present, and I think that's an important point, at least an important point regarding what we're talking about today. She also presents him as a modernist who believed in, and I quote, rational and scientific policy planning. Hanrieder also notes Mahler's role after retirement in his old age as an idol for health activists, many undoubtedly with socialist leanings. And similarly, Socrates Litzios emphasized the modernist and rational side of Mahler, which Litzios also found was sometimes lost in the widespread view of him as radical and anti-establishment. However, none of these examples give him a distinct political label, and socialist is not a word explicitly used in the recent academic literature to describe him. Next slide, please. Instead, the keywords that seems to be associated with Mahler are social justice, understood as an emphatic sense of solidarity with the most underprivileged people in the world, community participation, his idealism, but also coupled with a pragmatic attitude to obtaining results, a modernist belief in the rational process of planning, and although I admit not very apparent from the examples given here, a distinct hostility towards clinical medicine and sophisticated hospital-based healthcare, as well as an acute awareness of the social aspects of health. Now, I would like to reserve the rest of my talk to a discussion of how and where these views, the views that you see on the slide, were developed. In other words, I would like to focus on the early years of Mahler's career, and I do this simply because this is the part of his life that I have been studying most thoroughly and systematically. Next slide, please. So Mahler was born in Vivild in Denmark, not very far from where I'm sitting actually, in 1923. His father was an austere pastor and an excellent and charismatic preacher, while his mother, and Mahler appears to be much closer to his mother than to his father, she came from a family of physicians. He got his medical degree from the University of Copenhagen in 1948, and then went to India and spent most or a large part of the 1950s assigned to TB control projects in India. He came back and worked in the TB section of the World Health Organization in the 1960s, and became from 1969 a director for the Department of Systems Analysis, or perhaps Health Systems Analysis in the WHO, and Deputy Director General. In 1973, he was elected as Director General, and he served in that position for 15 years. And when he retired, he went on to become the director for 7 years of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. After that, he retired, but he became this idol for health activists throughout the world, most notably perhaps the People's Health Movement. Now, I will focus in this talk, I will focus on the time and the years Mahler spent in India, and discuss how that formed his views, and maybe also explain why we understand some of these views as socialist. But before that, I will just say a little bit about his years as a student in Copenhagen in Denmark in the 1940s. And next slide, please. So far, not much is known about Mahler's life as a student, but his formal education, the formal education, is not likely to have imbued him with ideas about the importance of social aspects of health and medicine. His education seems to have been conventional and clinically oriented. If anything, social and public health-oriented approaches to medicine seem to have been less developed in medical education in Denmark than in neighboring countries like Norway and Germany. I have, however, recently been informed that Mahler did, in fact, attend a socialist discussion club as a student, but I'll have to pursue this information more systematically in order to determine if it was a far less even revolutionary group, or it was a more mainstream left of center social democratic forum. I think it could have been both. I don't know yet where he went. We should also note, I think, that Mahler grew up in an incipient welfare state dominated by the Social Democratic Party, where public authorities increasingly and almost naturally assumed responsibility for public health initiatives, such as large informative campaigns and large-scale health examination of school children. Healthcare in Denmark was formally organized in insurance-based sick benefit associations. But from the 1930s, these associations gradually became less voluntary, more universal, and state-regulated, and also state-funded, until they were finally and formally abolished in 1973, and Denmark had this universal tax-based healthcare system. But in the 1940s, when Mahler attended university, it was in that decade that ideas about establishing this kind of universal state-run tax-based health system was first voiced and discussed. And I think it's interesting to note that among the themes that were clearly discussed among medical students in Copenhagen in the 1940s was the British Beveridge Report, which seemed to create a lot of interest. Anyway, a few years after obtaining his degree, in 1951, Mahler went to India, where he spent most of the next decade. He spent these, I think you can say, formative years of his career there as a WHO medical officer, seconded to TB control projects. First, he supervised India's massive BCG vaccination campaign. Then, in his second stint, that is from 1958 onwards, he was posted to the National Tuberculosis Institute in Bangalore, and his task was to supervise and contribute to the design of India's National Tuberculosis Control Program. So in India, he was first in charge of a massive mass vaccination effort, and then he came back and asked to contribute to this, to the development of a general Indian strategy to control TB. What did Mahler meet in India as a young doctor? He was 28 years old when he first came to India on WHO duty. And how did it influence his later thinking about health and society? And next slide, please. I think, first of all, Mahler met a high modernist belief in large-scale social planning and a lofty optimistic rhetoric accompanying the process of planning. And he met it immediately. In July 1951, exactly when Mahler's tenure as senior medical officer to the BCG mass campaign officially began, a draft outline of India's first 5-year plan was presented to the Indian public, and I quote, for general discussion and comment and for the widest possible public discussion, end of quote. 18 months later, in 1952, Prime Minister Nehru presented the first plan to the Lok Sabha, the Indian Parliament, commenting, "When I see these two heavy volumes of the report of the Planning Commission, my mind conjures up the vision of something vast, the mighty theme of a nation building and remaking itself." In the 1950s, India was, in general, impregnated with an idealistic rhetoric on planning, which was supposed to be carried into every home, as the first 5-year plan stated, as you can see on the slide, in 1951, in order to make the people partners in the plan. And 4 years later, actually 3 years later, because it was 1954, the dominant Congress Party committed itself to a socialist pattern of society. Next slide, please. And in 1961, towards the end of the decade, the year Mahler left India for WHO headquarters in Geneva, Nehru spoke publicly in Bangalore, where Mahler was based, and described the process of planning as a pilgrimage and as a tremendous effort being made by the Indian people. Now, in my analysis, Mahler was impressed by this rhetoric, and some of his socialism, or what we would like to understand as his socialism, and certainly some of his idealism might be traced back to this experience. The BCG mass vaccination campaign was integrated into the planning enterprise in India and explicitly written into the plan. These plans expounded that after 2 planned periods, or 10 years, all Indians under 25 years, or an estimated 170 million people, would have received the BCG vaccine. It was a high modernist faith in planning that only seemed possible in the 1950s. And I think Mahler believed in this rhetoric. And you can see from the report that he wrote while he was in India, the reports he wrote back to headquarters in Geneva and New York to UNICEF and to WHO and UNICEF, that when mass vaccination ran into trouble, and it often did, he often consoled himself that BCG mass vaccination, after all, was part of the 5-year plans and therefore ultimately on track. Next slide, please. In late 1952, Mahler gave an early example of his confidence in ambitious public health planning. 1.5 year of experience from mass BCG vaccination in India had proven, he told an audience in New Delhi, that it was, and I quote, not an utopian idea to plan public health programs for India's 360 million inhabitants. Mahler associated planning with a military approach when he in 1954 explained how mass vaccination with BCG had an important eye-opening effect on many public health authorities, especially in respect of the importance of detailed planning and military organization at all stages of a public health program. Now, this last quote is one of my favorite Mahler quotes: detailed planning and military organization. This was Mahler, the high modernist speaking, Mahler, the rationalist speaking. When Mahler returned to India in 1958, his task was different. He was no longer charged with running a high modernist vaccination campaign that invited this detailed planning and military organization. Instead, he was to participate in the more inductive and investigative task of developing a new general approach to tuberculosis control in India. Next slide, please. So if Mahler was now involved in a more investigative enterprise, his rhetoric on planning was taken to a more abstract level. The early policy papers from the National Tuberculosis Institute explicitly tied the task of the institute to the mighty adventure of large-scale planning in India. A technical report from 1959 stated, and that's the one you can see on the slide, for instance, that the development of health services in the privileged countries in Europe and North America has in many respects been haphazard and often very costly, both economically and in terms of human suffering and injustice. India, by contrast, believes in planning her future. If we change our focus from this general idea of planning and this general, at least at the rhetorical level, enthusiasm for planning in India in the 1950s and focus more specifically on health, Mahler obviously encountered India's appalling poverty, deplorable health condition, and a vastly inadequate health service which concentrated on providing health to privileged urban groups. And the next slide, which I would like to see now, gives some approximate numbers just to underline this point about, the difference in the level of healthcare in India and in the UK around 1940. But Mahler not only encountered, the stark realities on the ground, he also encountered ideas about how to improve the situation. The officially endorsed approach to health in India by 1951 was social medicine. Developed in Europe and Asia in the 1930s, this doctrine unfolded in India through the influential report of the Boer Committee, which was published in 1946. Important overseas proponents of social medicine, including John Ryle, John Grant, and Henry Sigerist, were all involved in the writing of this report, which became the foundational document on health policy in India in the years immediately after independence, the years Mahler spent in India. I think it is important to see the report of the Boer Committee, which must have been compulsory reading for any WHO officer on long-term duty in India, and the debate that followed in the wake of the report and along with the report as an Indian articulation of ideas associated with social medicine. The report emphasized, I think we should have the next slide. Sorry, I just, yeah, that's the one. The report emphasized suitable housing, sanitary surroundings, and a safe drinking water supply as the most important areas for intervention, health intervention, and praised the idea of social medicine for widening the conception of disease from the narrow view of tissue changes and microbial and other specific causes to include broader social, economic, and environmental factors. Next slide, please. The Boer Committee also explicitly warned against putting too much faith in technological fixes and magic wands that promise to solve India's health problems overnight. Considering systems of healthcare in the UK, the US, Canada, the Soviet Union, and New Zealand, the committee, or the report of the committee, had absolutely no doubt that India in the future should rely on a health system run by the state and funded by the state. In Nehru's India, this was simply understood as, and I quote, the modern trend. And this, of course, invoked something Mahler knew from his native Denmark and from Scandinavia. Social medicine also found its way into the first 5-year plan. The first 5-year plan's definition of health was strikingly similar to the definition found in the Constitution of the World Health Organization. And I quote, "Health is a positive state of well-being in which the harmonious development of physical and mental capacities of the individual leads to the enjoyment of a rich and full life. It is not a negative state of mere absence of disease." And those of you, and I'm sure you're familiar with the definition of health in the WHO Constitution, can see that these are very, very similar. Next slide, please. So, what views on health did Mahler articulate on health during his stay in India? Well, first, and I think most sort of clearly, he immediately developed a profound distaste for the highly educated and clinically oriented doctor. His reports back to the headquarters in Geneva and New York were full of contempt for the type of doctor that did not care about vaccinating the Indian masses against tuberculosis, but preferred to stay in their urban clinics. In 1955, for instance, Mahler referred to the, and I quote, the dearth of public health-minded doctors in a clinically infested atmosphere, and judged the influence of many doctors in the campaign to be positively harmful. Mahler had, on the other hand, great faith in the potential of the Indian masses. Mass BCG vaccination could, he believed, enlighten the population and make them demand better health. In 1952, for instance, he wrote, "When first the rural masses realize and are able to formulate their demands for a healthier life, no power can deny it to them." This view arguably translated into community participation in the formulation of primary health care 20 years later. It's more difficult to find.
People mute themselves, please. There's some extra talk going on. The listeners, please mute themselves.
Niels needs now to unmute.
Yes, I don't know. Okay, I think someone probably muted me, so I'll just say that it's more difficult to find an explicit endorsement of the general concept of social medicine in Mahler's writings, perhaps because Mahler did arrive in India in charge of the very type of vertical campaign against one disease that many proponents of social medicine, including the board committee, would warn against. When Mahler went back to India in 1958 and joined the NTI, the National Tuberculosis Institute, I think he remained largely loyal to the idea of mass vaccination, vertical mass vaccination. But the 1959 report, which I have already quoted, did point towards a more integrated and horizontal health service. The report stated, and next slide, please. There's a long quote from that report. "At a time where the whole policy of the country is directed towards the establishment of a skeleton generalized health service, ultimately to be developed to bringing health services to the farthest villages, all moves to divert money, personal and equipment to other purposes must be viewed with the greatest anxiety. Only if the specialists agree to build in their specialties into the National Health Service can this service become strong enough to meet its task. And only through such integration can the special services expect to be brought out to the masses of the population." So here's at least one articulation of the idea that the most important thing where the money should be spent would be to build strong health service systems or infrastructure rather than on single disease vertical campaigns. Finally, it should also be noted that the NTI pioneered a sociological section aiming to understand health in a broader social context and from the patient's perspective. Mahler employed Dr. Debaba Banerjee as the first head of the section, and Banerjee retrospectively identified the purpose of his professional life as subordinating medical knowledge to the people rather than the other way around. And Banerjee became a staunch and vocal advocate for primary health care and the Alma Ata Declaration. He also remained a lifelong friend of Mahler, and Mahler did recognize that he had learned a lot from Dr. Banerjee. Next slide, please. So what did Mahler learn, or what did Mahler adopt from India? And did what he adopted from India nurture what we might understand as socialist aspects of his thinking? Well, I think that Mahler adopted a firm belief in planning and in the state as the vehicle for planning. I also think he was profoundly influenced by the idealism and rhetoric of grand vision that surrounded planning in Nehru's India. Mahler must also have experienced a forceful encounter with the notion of social medicine without embracing the term very explicitly. More specifically, I think he developed, while he was in India, a distinct hostility to the clinically oriented, highly qualified doctor, an understanding of the potential in community participation, and emergent acceptance of the value of integrated horizontal health services as opposed to these more vertical campaigns that brought him to India in the first place. Now, these things which you see on the slides, these are all notions which could be associated with the vague term socialism. So if we are interested in understanding the social democratic, and even socialist elements in Mahler's thinking, his experience in Nehruvian India, Nehruvian soft socialist India, is an obvious place to look. I don't think it's the only place to look, but I think it's an important place to look. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niels. If people would please submit your questions through the Zoom chat function.
I'll just get a pen to write down. 1 second.
Ken, you only want questions by chat?
Go ahead, speak up. You got the floor, Gordy.
All right, well, I'm trying to formulate, but I can try and launch it if there's nobody else going.
Go ahead.
Is he back? I'm trying to see.
You're there.
Is he back?
Not yet. I can't see.
I'm back. Yes, please go on.
Okay. Well, this was very exciting. I feel like you brought the horse to water, but we didn't start drinking in terms of his main part of his career. Did you get any further in terms of his work in WHO, or you're not prepared to sort of critically think about that phase or discuss that with us tonight yet? As head of WHO.
I am looking into his work as the Director General of the WHO, and I'm happy to discuss it with you to the extent that I'm able to answer it. Absolutely. So please go on. If you want to ask questions about what happened in the 1970s and 1980s, I will ask as I best can.
All right. Well, let me try. I don't know if I can formulate this perfectly, but you know, after Alma Ata, there was a reaction to that. There was a counter movement, right? I forget what name it went under, but it was it sounds like it was these clinicians that he was deploring, saying, we don't need a public health primary care approach as was outlined. We need specific campaigns and tried to narrow that vision. And I'm wondering whether there were fundamental seeds of that reaction planted in the Alma Ata report, In other words, was there a failing to articulate that vision broadly enough, or is it really just that the times had changed and this neoliberal World Bank ascendancy politically became the order of the day? So talk about that interplay, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my own impression is that clearly one problem with primary health concept that it was sort of articulated at Alma-Ata was, of course, that it was a very broad and very vague concept which could mean many things. And what you're referring to is what we would normally call selective primary health care. And there was a strong reaction to that. I am wondering whether it would be who was behind that strong reaction. It seems that this is something which I would just say, I would just pose this as sort of loose ideas, that Mahler was perhaps sufficiently pragmatic to not to be so strongly against these selective primary health care proposals as the narrative often goes. I mean, it was one of his lieutenants, you can say, in the primary healthcare movement, Kenneth Newell, that was sort of reacting very strongly against this selective primary healthcare move. Whereas the impression that I'm getting from talking to people is that Mahler was perhaps more pragmatic and more sort of result oriented. But these are ideas that I cannot sort of I can only say that this is the way I'm looking at it at the moment.
Niels, we have a question from Seiji Yamada. What can we take from Mahler's legacy today?
Well, I think we can take, I mean, what we can take from Mahler today is, of course, that his ideas, or the ideas that he was sort of the main representative for, they are very much alive today, and they have been resurfacing several times. I mean, I don't know the latest story that well, but I think that they came back again with the social determinants of health, when a lot of people talked about that. I think there was he was sort of rediscovered when they sort of were celebrating or marking the 30 years of Alma-Ata in 2007. That there were some ideas here. There was a big conference in Astana in Kazakhstan to celebrate the 40 years of primary healthcare declaration, where, of course, the current Director General made a direct reference to Mahler in his opening speech. So I think that I mean, and we can, of course, we can see part of the problem of delivering vaccines globally today is of course that in many places we don't have the infrastructure in place to actually get vaccines out where they are needed. So I think that they are highly relevant, and they are surfacing not all the time, but they're certainly surfacing momentarily, and has been in recent years.
So, Niels, we have several questions from Meredith. Meredith, if you're on, would you like to frame your questions and ask them? No? Let's go to Chun Wei. Chun Wei, she asks, what was Mahler's reaction and responses when neoliberalism began to sweep the world and undermine PHC and Alma-Ata?
Well, that answer will be a little bit related to the answer that I gave before, and I think that I will still have to look more into that. My initial feeling is that although I think Mahler did give some very strong sort of what do you say? He voiced some very strong views in some of his speeches. It seems that, you know, he also understood that he might have to be have less of a confrontation with these views if you wanted the WHO to function. So the impression I'm getting is I am getting a impression of a person who knew that it might be necessary for him basically to work with these new ideas more than I think sort of we all have that at least that was my general sort of idea, or my general narrative was that he was extremely hostile to what happened in the 1980s. I think he might have been clearly didn't like it, clearly didn't prefer it, but he was also perhaps more of the kind of person who knew that he also needed to get funding. For instance, he also needed to accept where could he get the money from.
Henry Kahn asks, what more can we learn from the opening photo of Mahler with Fidel Castro? What was its approximate date?
I wouldn't know. I'm not sure when that photo is from. I think it might be around 1980, perhaps. It's taken from some WHO magazine.
We have a question from Rania Carter. Is it possible to elaborate on Mahler's position as to why he thought military involvement was positive?
Yes, I think that. Well, first of all, I think that what we also have to remember here is that I've been sort of giving a portrait of Mahler, the young Halfdan Mahler, the Halfdan Mahler of the 1950s. And the Halfdan Mahler of the 1950s would not be the same as Halfdan Mahler of the 1970s or the 1980s. I think what you have here is a man who is very idealistic and he seems from the sources I've seen, he seems to be very enthusiastic also about the path chosen by India, the planning, the belief that if we make rational choices, we can really make life better for a lot of people. Now somehow this goes against the sort of community participation, bottom-up person that we might associate with the 1970s. So I think that what I and Ted and Marcus with me, what we have to find out is, how his views changed, or how he could accommodate both these sides. The man who believed in planning in the state and also believed in communities. I mean, somehow it seems a little contradictory, and that was also why I chose to highlight from the literature that I gave in the beginning of my talk, to highlight those scholars who have actually seen in Mahler that he was not only radical anti-establishment, let the communities decide for themselves. He was also a man who believed in planning, and I think he was so clearly as a young person. I think he might have changed over time, but I think as a young person, he was clearly this high modernist.
And Emmanuel Byrne, you would like to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, mid 20th century social medicine in many settings, and I'm going to push you because you left out Latin America. You mentioned Europe and Asia, but of course social medicine was also very important in the Americas. But the concern was, and this evokes some of the comments you were just making now, regarding his interest in planning and top-down kind of state bureaucratic approaches. So, some of your talk mentioned his, how shall we put it, enlightenment around the importance of community approaches. And I wanted you to expand on some of the tensions and maybe some of the debates with social medicine colleagues, and perhaps those who were more formally or academically involved in social medicine around this kind of direct community, not just participation, but decision making and strong role. Thanks.
Yeah, Thank you, but I'm not sure I can give you I can give you much of that because what I have been looking at so far is basically what did Mahler adopt from India in the 1950s, and I think that he's adopting many of the elements in which I would associate with social medicine. For instance, this idea of community participation. What he's not adopting is the idea that the skepticism, for instance, which you find in some of the writings, for instance, of the report of the Boer Committee, some of the idea that you should not believe in technological solutions. I think that Mahler continues to believe in technological solutions as long as these technological solutions are appropriate, that is simple and available and things like that. And I think that there's a difference between sort of some kinds of social medicine where you're much more skeptical about technology as such. I think Mahler was never he was skeptical about sophisticated, sort of useless technology to be used in the big hospitals, but he remained, and I also think that primary healthcare as a doctrine remains loyal to immunization, for instance, essential drugs, and so on and so forth. And that was not a very good answer to your question, because I don't know, I haven't come around many of his sort of debates with people. I mean, I don't see in the sources from the 1950s. He's not debating with anyone. He's a young doctor who gives his views of what's happening and especially how the mass vaccination campaign is going. He gives these views back to the headquarters, and the main element in these reports are that he is getting sick and tired of the Indian highly qualified doctors. That's of the most salient feature of these sources, I think.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
So just in terms of his interlocutors, have you looked for any evidence directly with Carl Taylor while he was working in India? Because of course they interacted very closely over decades. And Taylor might have had a distinct position on this question from Mahler.
No, I know that there's a lot that I have been looking for that, because I know that there is that Taylor became very, very important in the 1970s and in the formulation of primary healthcare, and they were in India at the same time. And I would have loved to see if I could find a reference to Taylor, but I haven't found it. And I have also been talking to the family and looking for private letters, but there seems to be very, very little to get from. I mean, Mahler didn't leave an archive. That's of course a problem. It would have been so nice if he had been, if we had a personal archive. We don't. I haven't really found anything. But I agree. I think that it would be so interesting if we could have any kind of sources on Carl Taylor and Halfdan Mahler actually meeting in India in the 1950s. The 50s. They must have.
Niels, we have a question from Austin Wu. What value is there in having the term socialism used in the context of public health?
I don't know. I mean, I would not use the term socialism specifically. For me, it was also that the first part of what I said this afternoon was also to say that I don't think that Mahler was a socialist. I think that it is interesting to look at his actual views and see what specific ideas he had about health and whether they're socialist or not socialist. I think it's difficult to say, and for me it's not important if he was a socialist or not. I mean, there's so many ideas, and you can associate them with socialism, you can call them something else, and some ideas can surface both in a context you would understand as socialist and what a context you would understand as something else. So I'm not sure about the value I don't think using the lens of socialism makes us I'm not sure we learn more about Mahler by using that lens.
So Niels, I have a question. What I know this is outside the scope of what you're talking about, but you and some of the people in the audience do have some knowledge of the World Health Organization. What are we to make of the World Health Organization today and in the next 2 decades? And I leave it as an open discussion for other people if they want to participate.
Yeah, I think that's a very tough question, which I would perhaps like to ponder a little on. But I think that the World Health Organization has been, and of course the current crisis have shown, it's part of a political game, and it has been a part of a political game. It was during the Cold War. It was in the 1970s in the North-South divide, and now it's now it was sort of caught up in sort of the tensions between the US and China. And I think that it just shows that this is the nature of an international organization, and especially, of course, an international organization that is so relatively weak as the WHO is, because the WHO has very little power and very little money, so it can't do much. And you can see also, what happened to the COVAX initiative and all that. I mean, it is not a powerful organization. I'm sure we will hear a lot of rhetoric about strengthening the World Health Organization in light of what we have just been through, still going through in many parts of the world. But whether it's going to happen or not is more doubtful, I think. But my view is just, anybody else's view is as good as this, because,
Anybody else want to comment? Meredith says WHO is bankrupt. Morally, financially, or both, Meredith? Any other comments or questions?
Perhaps I can. Steve Sapiri.
I have a couple of questions that people have posed. I just wanted to get them in about the latter stage of Mahler's career after 1996, after he formally retired. And one question is, did he have anything to do with the revival of primary care interest in WHO under Margaret Chan's director generalship? And also related to that, what was his connection with the people's health movement in that period? And how do these two perhaps play together?
Yes, we have, and I have done that together with Ted. We have talked with some people from the people's health movement, and what we have learned is, because I think, there was always for me this suspicion, and still is the suspicion, that Mahler was somehow almost hijacked by the people health movement. He was this grand old man who you could put up in front of your movement, almost like as a token. What we have been told is that Mahler was actively joining the movement. He was actually asking to be involved. My own, Ted can correct me if he has a different view. My own sort of provisional view is that I think that Mahler perhaps grew more radical, more sort of activist, more sort of desperate about doing something after retirement. So that, I said my impression was that he was perhaps more pragmatic, more trying to have a lot of things going in the 1980s. But I think that once he retired, he might have gotten rid of that kind of obligation to make an organization work and simply just become an activist. But that's more like an idea to be pursued than it's something that I can document fully. But I think that he found perhaps a new sense of purpose with the people health movement, and was actively asking to become involved, as far as I understand it.
And indeed felt excluded from the WHO. Even there was a question about credentials at one of the World Health Assembly meetings, and he found that his natural alliance and affinity was with the younger people in the people's health movement. That he made very clear in the interviews we've had so far.
Mm.
Stephen Sappery, you had a question?
Oh, okay. I worked in WHO for 30 years, about the same time that Mahler was in headquarters, and got to know him pretty well at one point in time. But I was surprised by a contact I had with him at the end of my career and at the end of his, in which I noted that the style of planning that we had worked on so long for implementation in countries, but at all levels, requires a great deal of administrative management. It's not something that just happens by itself. And he reacted very negatively to that, saying that he doesn't want to hear anything about administrative planning inside of bureaucracies, because he felt the only worthwhile efforts were being made down in the community level. It was almost as if he was throwing me out of the meeting, but it was a view that I hadn't heard him express quite that distinctly before.
But I think that's very interesting, and it's definitely a view which does not fit very well with the view I try to present of the young Mahler, who would certainly believe in and be enthusiastic about this idea that we can actually plan, the state can plan for better health. So what we have here is an interesting case of a man who might have changed his views and grown increasingly disillusioned with whatever he saw of misguided state planning throughout his career, perhaps. But that's just a guess. I think it's a very interesting, valuable point you're making there.
And it was also part of his view when he was working in Geneva in the 1960s, when he headed up the unit that was supposed to develop health systems planning and health systems review. He was very much committed to that in that specific context. And I think he moved away from it in the 70s as he got closer to Alma Ata.
Yeah, if I may, that was the unit that I belonged to.
Ah, well, that makes sense.
We were all systems analysis and non-medical people brought together to create a methodology for guiding planning processes at various levels. He passed through very quickly our effort. He was assigned as the director of it to begin with, but he soon became deputy director general, and then quickly after that he became a director general. And his views changed as he passed from one level to another through the organization. And I'm not blaming him for that. He was obviously reflecting upon reactions that he had received or were emerging new. And yet I was surprised at the end of his career and mine, how far apart we seem to be.
Mm-hmm.
But the instance you referred to, that was very late in his career, also in the WHO. That would have been towards the end of the 1980s, right? Is that correctly understood?
No, the instance where he was temporarily our director was right at the beginning of my career in about 68.
But when did you have the conversation in which you said he almost threw you out of the meeting, or you had that impression?
That one was at the end of.
Yeah, that's what Niels is trying to say.
Okay.
So Niels, I believe that you're working on developing this material into a book. If you would like, you could put your email address into the chat. And if people who have direct contact with Mahler or comments on this could reach you.
Would be wonderful, because especially because we can't find this private papers. So there's a lot of things we'd like to know for people who met him. So yes, I'll put it into the chat immediately. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ken, are we wrapping up? Do we have time for one more question, or are we going?
We do have time for one more question. I'm just waiting for Niels to put his email in, but take the next question. Go ahead.
To get back to it.
I mean, I'll raise one, which is really probably a
Go
more
ahead, Gordy.
big question. But so global mass vaccination is something that's definitely on the agenda these days. How to do it, why it's failing, where we need to go. There must be some lessons from his work in mass vaccination, right? So I think BCG, you could ask whether it's the most effective vaccine against TB or not, although maybe you could raise that with COVID as well. But so there must be an article or perspective that could be distilled out of that could be applicable to the current mass vaccination dilemmas.
Well,
Yes.
before we answer that, Niels, we have to remember that it was under Mahler's director generalship that the smallpox eradication campaign was completed and declared a great success. That was very much under his watch, and he very much supported that, all the while that he was also leading up to Alma-Ata, which is an interesting set of ideas we have to pull together.
Yes, if I can just say two things to this again, my impression is from what I've read so far is that Mahler was proud of two things during his career. One was the eradication of smallpox, and the other was primary healthcare. But the latter was clearly more important to him than the former. That is my impression. But yes, I mean, Mahler did actually, the BCG mass vaccination campaign did in fact encounter a lot of opposition in India. And I've written about this together with an American historian called Christian Macmillan. We have an article in a journal called Comparative Studies in Society and History from 2010, I think, where we analyzed the opposition against BCG in India in the 1950s. And Christian Macmillan has written a book on TB, global TB, where it also is, and it is also in my book on TB control in India, and it's also referred briefly in Randy Packer's book, the 2016 book on a history of global health, and it's very interesting the type of opposition to BCG that you encounter in the 1950s. It's also worth saying that most of the opposition, I think just coincidentally, is actually before Mahler joins the campaign and then after he left it, because it's sort of in 1949, 1950, before Mahler comes in, and then it flares up again in 1955 after he's left. I don't think it has anything to do with whether he's there or not. But what you can see in this campaign is you can see Indian advocates of social medicine criticizing the campaign for being a technological fix, for being the wrong way to do TB control in India. And they could, of course, refer to the fact that the efficacy of BCG was not proven, and actually was disproven by a large trial in India, the Chingleput trial from the 1970s. In fact, that it seems that BCG didn't really have an effect, at least not in India, on pulmonary TB. You could also see in sort of the opposition that flared up in India. You could also see people who basically used, as we're also seeing today, and certainly today, using their opposition against the state, against the intrusive state, as an opposition against, using anti-vax as a vehicle for expressing that kind of opposition to the state. I mean, and that the state should not interfere. The state should not compel people to take vaccines, and so on and so forth. So there are some very, very interesting parallels to get from what happened with BCG in the 1950s. Absolutely.
Any last questions?
I can see in the chat someone, Anne Emmanuel, said that yes, he also said never again after smallpox eradication, and refused to take on polio eradication. And I think it says something about the fact that there was some type of skepticism in Mahler, even with smallpox eradication. I agree with that, and that's also why I think that for him primary healthcare was much more important than the eradication of smallpox.
Thank you, Niels. The link to the recording of this session will be sent to all registrants when it has been posted to YouTube. You can view recordings of all of our sessions on YouTube. We thank you, Niels. We thank our audience for joining us. Please join us for future sessions. Our next session will be in April about abortion and reproductive justice. Everyone, please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right, if I close up the session.
Give me a second.
Okay.